Sometimes the people who control us most are the ones who love us deepest. Sometimes survival means making choices that break your heart every single day. In the Montana Territory of the 1800s, Silas McGraw kept his sister under strict control in their mountain cabin. He treated her more like property than family. For years, she obeyed his every command because the wilderness was dangerous for women alone. But as she grew stronger and wiser, something changed between them. Silas began to see her differently. She wasn't just someone to protect anymore. She was the only person who understood his pain. When he finally offered her freedom, he also offered her marriage. He wanted her to become his wife. But can real love grow from such a twisted beginning? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wooden cross hung crooked on the cabin wall, its edges worn smooth by countless touches from hands that had long since turned to dust. Sarah McGraw straightened it each morning, a ritual that brought her small comfort in a world where comfort was scarce. The cross was all that remained of their mother's faith, a faith that had died with her 12 winters ago when the fever took both parents within days of each other. Sarah pressed her palm against the rough-hewn logs of the cabin wall and closed her eyes, remembering her mother's gentle voice humming hymns while she worked. Those memories felt like dreams now, fragile things that might shatter if examined too closely. At 22, Sarah had lived more years without her mother than with her, yet the ache of that loss never fully healed. Sarah. Silas's voice cut through her reverie like an axe through kindling. The fire's dying. She turned to see her brother, though the word felt strange on her tongue these days, standing in the doorway with an armload of split wood. Snow dusted his broad shoulders and clung to his dark beard. At 28, Silas McGraw was a mountain of a man, 6 feet and 4 inches of muscle and sinew carved by years of hard living. His hands, scarred from countless encounters with wild animals and wilder men, handled the firewood with surprising gentleness. Sarah began, daydreaming again. His grey eyes, the color of storm clouds, fixed on her with that familiar mixture of affection and exasperation. Dreams don't keep the cabin warm. Sarah bit back her response and moved to tend the fire. She had learned long ago that arguing with Silas was like trying to move a mountain with bare hands. He saw the world in simple terms, safe or dangerous, useful or wasteful, necessary or foolish. Dreams, in his estimation, fell squarely into the last category. The cabin was small but sturdy, built by their father's hands and reinforced over the years by Silas's endless improvements. One room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room, with a stone fireplace that dominated the far wall. A wooden ladder led to the loft where Sarah slept, while Silas claimed the small alcove behind the kitchen as his domain. Every inch served a purpose, nothing wasted. Nothing purely decorative, except for that crooked cross and the few wildflowers Sarah sometimes gathered in defiance of Silas's practical nature. "Storm's coming in heavy," Silas said, stacking the wood beside the hearth. "Could last 3, maybe 4 days. You'll need to stretch the supplies." Sarah nodded, though her mind wandered to the hidden journal tucked beneath the loose floorboard near her bed. Between its pages lay pressed flowers from every season. Mountain laurel from spring, black-eyed Susans from summer, golden aspen leaves from autumn. Each one represented a moment stolen from Silas's watchful eyes. A small rebellion pressed flat between sheets of paper. She had been keeping the journal for 3 years, writing by candlelight after Silas fell asleep. Sometimes she recorded the day's events, but more often she wrote about the dreams he dismissed so easily. Dreams of traveling beyond these mountains, of seeing cities with more than 50 souls, of dancing at a real celebration instead of just humming while she worked. "Sarah," Silas's voice held a warning note. "Where are you?" "I'm here." She straightened, meeting his gaze. "Always here." Something flickered across his face, an expression she couldn't quite read. In the firelight, his features seemed softer, more like the brother who had held her during thunderstorms when they were children. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by his usual stern demeanor. "Good," he said. "I've got traps to check before the worst of the storm hits. You'll stay inside until I return." It wasn't a request. Sarah had learned to recognize the difference between Silas's suggestions and his commands. This was definitely the latter. "What if someone needs help?" she asked, thinking of their nearest neighbor, old Pete, who lived 2 miles down the mountain. At 73, Pete's arthritis made winter especially brutal. "Pete survived longer winters than this one," Silas replied, pulling on his heavy coat. "Besides, anyone fool enough to be out in this weather deserves what they get." The words stung with their casual cruelty, though Sarah suspected Silas didn't mean them quite as harshly as they sounded. He had been shaped by this unforgiving landscape, hardened like metal in a forge. Compassion, in his experience, was a luxury that could get you killed. After he left, Sarah moved to the single window and watched his familiar figure disappear into the swirling snow. The silence that followed his departure felt different from the comfortable quiet she cherished during his hunting trips. Today, it felt heavy with unspoken tensions and questions she dared not voice. She climbed to her loft and carefully pried up the loose board that hid her treasures. The journal's leather cover was soft with age, its pages filled with her careful handwriting and those pressed flowers that represented the only beauty she was allowed to claim as her own. Opening to a fresh page, she began to write, "Another storm comes, and with it, another season of feeling more like a possession than a person. Silas means well. I tell myself this daily like a prayer. He has protected me, fed me, kept me alive when the world outside would have swallowed a woman alone without a second thought. But protection has become a cage, and I fear I'm forgetting what it feels like to make my own choices." She paused, listening for the sound of his return, then continued, "Sometimes I catch him looking at me strangely, as if seeing someone else entirely. The way his eyes linger on my face when he thinks I'm not watching makes my skin feel tight and strange. These moments frighten me more than any blizzard or wild animal ever could, because they suggest that the nature of his protection might be changing into something else entirely." A gust of wind rattled the cabin, and Sarah quickly closed the journal, returning it to its hiding place. She busied herself with preparing a stew from their dwindling supplies, trying to push away thoughts that had been growing stronger with each passing season. When Silas returned hours later, stamping snow from his boots and cursing the weather, Sarah had the meal ready and the cabin warm. She served him without meeting his eyes, afraid of what he might see in her expression. "Good stew," he said after several spoonfuls. "Thank you." "You didn't go outside." It wasn't a question, but Sarah answered anyway. "No, I stayed inside as you asked. As I told you," he corrected gently. "There's a difference." She looked up then, startled by the unusual softness in his voice. In the lamplight, his face showed signs of the internal struggle she had begun to recognize but couldn't name. Whatever war raged inside Silas McGraw, she was somehow at the center of it. "Sarah," he said, then stopped, seeming to search for words that wouldn't come. "Yes." "Nothing." He returned to his meal, but the moments stretched between them like a bridge neither dared cross. "Just stay close to the cabin tomorrow, even after the storm passes." That night, as wind howled through the mountain passes and snow piled against their door, Sarah lay in her loft, listening to Silas move restlessly in the room below. Sleep seemed to elude them both, and in the darkness, she wondered what would happen when this strange tension between them finally reached its breaking point. The crooked cross caught a sliver of moonlight, its shadow dancing on the wall like a reminder of faith long lost and innocence that could never be reclaimed. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the world wrapped in pristine white silence. Sarah was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she heard the sound, a desperate, keening cry that cut through the mountain stillness like a blade. A woman stumbled into their clearing, her dark hair matted with blood, her dress torn and stained. She collapsed to her knees in the snow, one hand pressed to her side, where crimson bloomed through the fabric. "Please," the woman gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. "Help me," Sarah dropped the wet sheet she'd been hanging and rushed to the stranger's side. The woman was perhaps 30 years old, with delicate features that spoke of a gentler life than most frontier women knew. Her hands, though now dirty and bloodied, showed no calluses from hard labor. "What happened?" Sarah asked, helping the woman to her feet. "My husband." The woman swayed, her face pale as fresh snow. "He's coming. He'll kill me this time. I won't go back." Sarah glanced toward the tree line, listening for sounds of pursuit, but heard only the whisper of wind through pine boughs. Silas was checking his trap lines and wouldn't return until evening. The decision was hers alone. "Come inside," Sarah said, wrapping her arm around the woman's waist. "Let me tend to your wounds." The woman leaned heavily against her as they made their way to the cabin. Once inside, Sarah helped her to the wooden chair beside the fire and began examining her injuries. The worst was a gash along her ribs where something sharp had torn through her dress and into the flesh beneath. "What's your name?" Sarah asked as she heated water and gathered clean cloth. "Mary." The woman winced as Sarah began cleaning the wound. "Mary Hartwell. My husband was Thomas Hartwell. He owns land near Bozeman." Sarah had heard the name whispered in trading posts. Thomas Hartwell was known for his wealth and his temper in equal measure. "Why did you run?" Sarah asked gently, though the evidence was written in bruises across Mary's throat and arms. Mary laughed bitterly. "Because I finally understood that staying would mean dying by degrees. Every day, a little more of me disappeared until I couldn't remember who I'd been before I became his property." The word property hit Sarah like a physical blow. She paused in her ministrations, meeting Mary's eyes in the firelight. "He said I belonged to him," Mary continued. "That marriage gave him the right to do whatever he pleased. That I was his to command, his to punish, his to break if he chose." Sarah's hands trembled as she bandaged the wound. "But surely, marriage isn't supposed to be like that. Marriage is supposed to be about love, isn't it?" "Love?" Mary's smile held no warmth. "Child, I thought so too once upon a time. I thought Thomas loved me when he courted me so ardently, when he promised me the world. But what he loved was the idea of owning something beautiful and innocent. Once he had me, once I was legally his," she shuddered. "Love had nothing to do with it." As the afternoon wore on, Mary told Sarah about her life, the gradual erosion of her freedom, the way Thomas had isolated her from friends and family, the escalating violence that had finally driven her to flee into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back. "I had a wedding ring once," Mary said, touching her bare finger. "Diamonds and gold that sparkled like starlight. He ripped it from my finger during our last fight, said I didn't deserve to wear it, said I was nothing but a faithless whore who needed to be taught her place." "Where will you go?" Sarah asked. "I have a sister in California. If I can reach her," Mary's voice broke, "but I'm not sure I'll live to see another sunrise." The cold, the loss of blood. Sarah saw the truth in Mary's fading color, the way her breathing grew more labored with each passing hour. She made Mary as comfortable as possible, sharing their precious supplies of food and clean water, but they both knew it wasn't enough. "Tell me about your life here," Mary said, as evening shadows lengthened. "You seem so young to be living alone in these mountains." "I'm not alone," Sarah replied. "My brother takes care of me." "Your brother?" Mary studied Sarah's face carefully. "And is he good to you?" The question caught Sarah off guard. "He protects me, provides for me. I've never wanted for anything." "That's not what I asked," Mary said softly. "Does he treat you like a sister should be treated? Or does he treat you like—" She gestured to her own battered form. "Silas would never hurt me," Sarah said quickly. "He's never raised a hand to me, never—" "There are other ways to imprison someone," Mary interrupted. "Other ways to make a person disappear until they forget they ever had choices of their own." The words hung between them like smoke from the dying fire. Sarah found herself thinking of all the times Silas had made decisions for her, all the times her own desires had been dismissed or ignored. But that was different, wasn't it? That was protection, not imprisonment. "Does he let you make your own choices?" Mary asked. "About what to wear, where to go, who to speak with?" Does he ask your opinion about things that matter, or does he simply tell you what will happen? Sarah opened her mouth to defend Silas, but the words wouldn't come. When had she last made a decision about anything important? When had Silas last asked what she wanted, rather than simply informing her what she would do? "I see the understanding in your eyes," Mary whispered. "The recognition. You know, don't you? You know what you are to him." Before Sarah could respond, Mary's breathing became labored, rattling in her chest like stones in a jar. Sarah held her hand as the woman struggled against the inevitable. "Listen to me," Mary gasped, her grip surprisingly strong. "Listen carefully. A woman is not property. A woman is not a thing to be owned or commanded or shaped to another's will. We are human beings with minds and hearts and souls of our own. Don't let anyone, not your brother, not any man, convince you otherwise." With trembling fingers, Mary reached into her torn bodice and withdrew something small and golden. "Take this," she said, pressing it into Sarah's palm. "It was my grandmother's ring, the only thing Thomas never knew I had. Keep it as a reminder that you deserve to choose your own path." The ring was simple gold, worn smooth by generations of wear, with a small inscription inside the band that read, "Love freely given." Sarah stared at it through tears. She didn't realize she was shedding. "Promise me," Mary whispered, her voice fading like wind through leaves. "Promise me you won't let them steal your choices the way they stole mine." "I promise," Sarah said. Though she wasn't sure what she was promising, Mary smiled then, a peaceful expression that transformed her battered features. "Good, that's good." She died as the sun set behind the mountains, her hand still clasped in Sarah's, the wedding ring warm against Sarah's palm like a small ember of possibility. When Silas returned an hour later, he found Sarah sitting beside Mary's still form, staring into the fire with an expression he'd never seen before. "Who is she?" he asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. "A woman fleeing her husband," Sarah replied without looking up. "She died of her injuries." Silas examined the body with the detached efficiency of a man accustomed to death. "Thomas Hartwell's wife," he said after a moment, recognizing her despite the damage. "He's probably looking for her." "Let him look," Sarah said, and something in her tone made Silas turn to study her face. "Sarah, she was married for 7 years," Sarah continued, as if he hadn't spoken. 7 years of being told what to do, what to think, what to feel. 7 years of having every choice taken from her until she forgot she'd ever had any. "The frontier is hard on women," Silas said carefully. "Men do what they must to protect what's theirs." "What's theirs?" Sarah stood abruptly, her eyes blazing. "Is that what I am, Silas? Is that what you think I am?" The question hung between them like a challenge thrown down in the dust. Silas opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, seeing something in Sarah's face that made him wary. "You're my sister," he said finally. "My responsibility, but not my own person. Not someone with thoughts and desires and dreams that matter." "Dreams are dangerous out here," Silas replied, falling back on familiar ground. "Dreams get people killed." "Maybe," Sarah said, clutching Mary's ring tight in her fist. "But maybe being too afraid to dream is just another way of dying." That night, Sarah helped Silas carry Mary's body to the shed, where it would keep until the ground thawed enough for burial. As they worked in silence, Sarah felt the weight of Mary's words settling into her bones like winter cold. For the first time in her life, she found herself questioning everything she had accepted as natural and necessary. The questions Mary had planted in her mind bloomed like flowers in spring soil, and Sarah began to wonder what her life might look like if she had the courage to seek answers. The ring hidden in her pocket seemed to pulse with its own warmth, a reminder of promises made and choices yet to be claimed. The days following Mary's death stretched like a taut wire between Sarah and Silas. Where once their routines had flowed with practiced ease, now every interaction carried the weight of unspoken questions. Sarah found herself studying her brother with new eyes, seeing patterns she had never noticed before. "Why can't I go to the trading post with you?" she asked one morning as Silas prepared for his monthly trip to town. He paused in the act of loading his pack, surprised by the question. In 12 years, she had never asked to accompany him. "It's a hard ride," he said. 2 days each way through rough country. "I'm not afraid of hard rides. The town isn't safe for women alone. I wouldn't be alone. I'd be with you." Silas straightened, his jaw tightening. "The answer is no, Sarah. You stay here where you're safe." Safe from what exactly? The challenge in her voice made him turn to face her fully. From making decisions? From talking to other people? From seeing what lies beyond these mountains? Safe from men who would take one look at you and... He stopped himself, color rising in his neck. "And what?" Sarah pressed. "And see something they want to claim," he finished roughly. The words hung between them like a confession neither was ready to examine too closely. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she recognized something dangerous in his tone. "Is that what you see when you look at me?" she asked quietly. "Something to be claimed?" Silas turned away, busying himself with unnecessary adjustments to his pack. "I see someone who needs protecting, from everyone except you." The question seemed to strike him like a physical blow. When he finally met her eyes, she saw something raw and conflicted in his expression. "I would never hurt you," he said. "I know." Sarah's voice softened slightly. "But keeping me here, isolated from everything and everyone, isn't that a kind of hurt too?" Silas left without answering, and Sarah spent his absence exploring areas of the cabin she had never thoroughly examined. In the storage space beneath the main floor, she discovered her father's old trapping maps. Carefully preserved and wrapped in oiled cloth, she spread them across the kitchen table, tracing the intricate pathways her father had mapped through the mountain wilderness. The maps showed trading posts, settlements, river crossings, a whole world that existed beyond their isolated valley. Towns with names like Silver Creek, Copper Falls, and Bear's Den, places where people gathered, where life happened in ways she could barely imagine. One map showed the route to California, the path Mary had hoped to take to reach her sister. Sarah's finger followed the winding trail through mountain passes and across rivers, wondering if Mary's sister still waited for news that would never come. When Silas returned 3 days later, he found Sarah sitting at the table with the maps spread before her. His face darkened when he saw what she was studying. "Put those away," he said. "Why?" Sarah looked up at him calmly. "They belong to our father. Don't I have a right to see them?" "They'll give you ideas." "Good. I need ideas." She folded one of the maps carefully. "I've been thinking about Mary, about what she said. About choices." Silas set down his pack with controlled force. Mary Hartwell was a foolish woman who got herself killed chasing dreams that were never going to come true. She was a woman who tried to escape a prison. She was protected and provided for. Her husband might have been harsh, but she had a roof over her head and food in her belly. That's more than most women can say. Sarah stared at him, seeing clearly for the first time how he viewed the world and her place in it. "You think that's enough? You think survival is all a woman should want?" "I think survival is all anyone can count on out here. But what if it's not enough anymore?" She stood, meeting his gaze steadily. "What if I want more than just staying alive?"
"Like what?"
The question was asked with such genuine bewilderment that Sarah almost felt sorry for him. He truly couldn't imagine what else she might desire, like seeing those places on the maps, like talking to people who aren't you, like making my own decisions about my own life. She paused, gathering courage for the next words. "Like having a husband and children of my own someday." Something flashed across Silas's face, an expression so quick and fierce that Sarah took a step backward. But when she blinked, it was gone, replaced by his usual stern mask. "Marriage is a trap," he said flatly. "Look what it did to Mary Hartwell. Not all marriages are like that. Most are. Men take what they want from women, and women have no choice but to endure it. Then maybe the problem isn't marriage itself, but the kind of men women are forced to accept." Silas stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah had the unsettling feeling that they were having two different conversations, one spoken and one beneath the surface. "You don't know anything about men," he said finally. about what they're capable of when they want something badly enough. Then teach me. The words came out before Sarah could stop them. Let me meet other people. Let me see how the world works beyond these walls. No, the word came out sharp and final. It's too dangerous. For me or for you? The question clearly startled him. What do you mean? I mean, maybe you're not protecting me from the world. Maybe you're protecting yourself from losing control over me. For a moment, Sarah thought he might strike her. His hands clenched into fists, and his face went white with anger. But then he turned away, walking to the window to stare out at the snow-covered peaks. You don't understand, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Then help me understand. You can't. He turned back to face her, and she saw something like desperation in his eyes. You can't understand because you don't. He stopped, seeming to struggle with words that wouldn't come. I'm not what, Silas? You're not like other women, he said finally. You're special, pure. The world would ruin you. Or maybe it would set me free. That night, Sarah lay in her loft, listening to Silas pace the floor below. His restlessness had become a nightly occurrence since Mary's death, as if something caged inside him was testing the strength of its prison. She thought about the maps hidden now beneath her mattress, about the ring wrapped in cloth and tucked away with her journal. Small rebellions, perhaps, but they felt like the beginning of something larger. For the first time in her life, Sarah found herself planning. Not just dreaming, but actually considering practical steps toward a different future. She began to notice which supplies Silas brought back from town, how much money he kept hidden in the coffee tin above the stove, how often he made his trading trips. She started testing small boundaries, staying outside past sunset, speaking her mind more freely, asking questions about topics he preferred to avoid. Each small act of defiance felt like stretching muscles that had been cramped too long. Silas responded to these changes with increasing tension. His watchfulness became more intense, his restrictions more detailed. Where once he had trusted her to stay close to the cabin while he worked, now he checked on her constantly throughout the day. Where were you? He asked one afternoon when he found her returning from a walk to the creek. Getting water, she replied, holding up the bucket as evidence. The creek is only a 10-minute walk. You've been gone for an hour. I stopped to watch the deer drinking at the bend. It was true, but not the whole truth. She had also been examining the path that led down the mountain toward the main trading route. You shouldn't wander so far. Alone. It's barely a mile from the cabin. A mile is too far. Sarah set down the water bucket with unnecessary force. How far is far enough, Silas? 10 feet 5. Should I stay within arm's reach at all times? Don't be dramatic. I'm not being dramatic. I'm being honest. Every day, the boundaries get smaller. Every day, you find new reasons why I can't do things I've done for years. The world is getting more dangerous. Or maybe you're getting more afraid. Again, that flash of something dark and desperate in his eyes. Maybe I have good reason to be afraid. Of what? Of losing you. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. In those 3 words, Sarah heard more vulnerability than Silas had shown in years, but also something that made her skin prickle with unease. I'm not going anywhere, she said carefully. Aren't you? His gaze moved to the maps she thought she had hidden so well. Don't think I don't see what you're planning, Sarah. Don't think I can't read the rebellion in your eyes. She lifted her chin, meeting his stare with newfound courage. And if I'm planning something? If I am ready for a life beyond these mountains? What then? Then I'll do whatever I have to do to keep you safe, even if it means keeping me prisoner. Even then, the words chilled Sarah more than any mountain wind ever had. In that moment, she saw her future stretching ahead like a long, cold winter, endless years of shrinking boundaries and increasing isolation until she became nothing more than a shadow of the woman she might have been. That night, she added a new entry to her journal. Today, I finally understood what Mary meant about disappearing by degrees. Silas's love, if that's what this is, feels more like quicksand with each passing day. The harder I struggle to free myself, the deeper I sink. But Mary also taught me something else, that a woman has the right to choose her own path, even if that path leads through dangerous territory. I'm beginning to think the greatest danger isn't what lies beyond these mountains. The greatest danger is staying here and slowly forgetting that I was ever meant to be more than Silas McGraw's carefully guarded possession. The fragment of mirror had once belonged to their mother, part of a vanity set their father had given her as a wedding gift. Most of the pieces had been lost or broken over the years, but this single shard remained, hidden away in a box of their mother's belongings that Silas kept in the storage room. Sarah found it while searching for extra blankets during a particularly cold snap. The mirror piece was no larger than her palm, its silvered surface spotted with age. But when she held it up to catch the lamplight, her own face looked back at her with startling clarity. She had not seen her reflection in years. The creek water showed only wavering glimpses, and Silas had never bothered to acquire a proper mirror for the cabin. Now studying herself in the fractured glass, Sarah felt a shock of recognition and surprise. The girl she remembered was gone, replaced by a woman with high cheekbones and full lips, with eyes the deep blue of mountain lakes and hair the color of autumn wheat. Her mother's features had emerged in her face, refined and made beautiful by the passage of time. "I'm pretty," she whispered to her reflection, surprised by the realization. More than pretty. She was beautiful in a way that would turn heads and stop conversations. The knowledge hit her like cold water. No wonder Silas watched her so carefully, spoke so grimly about the dangers of town. No wonder he seemed increasingly agitated by her presence, increasingly desperate to keep her hidden away. She was not the child he could protect with simple authority anymore. She was a woman, and her womanhood changed everything between them. That evening, she paid closer attention to the way Silas looked at her. What she had once interpreted as brotherly concern took on new and troubling dimensions when viewed through the lens of her newfound awareness. When she bent to stir the stew, she caught him staring at the curve of her waist. When she reached for something on a high shelf, his eyes followed the stretch of her body with an intensity that made heat rise in her cheeks. When she spoke, his gaze lingered on her mouth in a way that made her suddenly conscious of every word. "Is something wrong?" she asked, catching him in one of these moments of study. He jerked his attention back to his meal. Nothing's wrong, but something was very wrong, and they both knew it. The air between them had become charged with an undercurrent neither wanted to acknowledge. Sarah found herself moving differently around the cabin, hyper-aware of his presence, of the way his eyes tracked her movements. For his part, Silas had begun to display a restlessness that went beyond his usual winter confinement. He chopped wood with unnecessary violence, paced the cabin like a caged wolf, and started conversations only to abandon them mid-sentence when his thoughts led him down paths he couldn't traverse. "You should wear your hair differently," he said one morning, his voice strangely hoarse. Sarah paused in braiding her long hair, meeting his eyes in surprise. "What? Your hair? You should—" He cleared his throat, looking away. "You should pin it up. Keep it out of your face." She had worn her hair in braids since childhood. The style was practical for their mountain life, keeping the long strands from tangling in wind or catching on branches. But now, studying Silas's carefully averted gaze, Sarah understood that practicality was not his concern. "Does it bother you?" she asked, deliberately letting her hair fall loose around her shoulders. The effect on Silas was immediate and unmistakable. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched, and his breathing became noticeably heavier. "Pin it up," he said, his voice rough with something that might have been anger or desperation. "Why?" "Because I told you to." "That's not an answer. It's the only answer you're going to get." But Sarah had discovered something powerful in that moment, the ability to affect him, to crack his iron control with nothing more than the toss of her hair or the angle of her body. The knowledge was dangerous and intoxicating in equal measure. She began to test this newfound power in small ways. A longer look held across the dinner table, a casual touch as she passed behind his chair, the deliberate emphasis of her feminine movements as she went about her daily tasks, each experiment produced a visible reaction from Silas. A tightening of his features, a sharp intake of breath, a moment when his careful composure slipped to reveal something raw and hungry beneath. "What are you doing?" he asked one evening after she had spent the day moving through the cabin like a dancer, all grace and conscious femininity. "I don't know what you mean." "You know exactly what I mean." His voice was low and dangerous. "This game you're playing, it needs to stop." "What game?" Sarah turned to face him fully, letting the firelight play across her features. "I'm just being myself." "No, you're not. You're being—" He struggled for words, his face flushed with emotion. "You're being deliberately provocative. Is that what you think I'm doing?" She took a step closer, and he immediately moved back, as if she carried some contagious disease. "Provoking you?" "Sarah, stop this." "Stop what?" "Stop being a woman? Stop growing up? Stop existing in ways that make you uncomfortable. Stop making this harder than it already is." The admission slipped out before he could stop it, and both of them froze at the implications of his words. "Making what harder?" Sarah asked softly. Silas turned away, gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles went white. "You don't understand what you're doing to me. Then explain it to me." "I can't." "Why not?" "Because it's wrong." The words came out like a confession torn from his soul. "Because it's sick and wrong and I should be able to control it, but I—" He stopped, pressing his palms against his eyes. "God help me, I can't." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as understanding dawned. All the pieces of the puzzle suddenly fell into place, his increasing protectiveness, his desperate attempts to keep her isolated, his strange looks and careful distance. "Silas," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't." He held up a hand without turning around. "Don't say anything. Just go to bed, please." But Sarah couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't think past the revelation that had just exploded between them. Her brother, the man who had raised her, protected her, controlled her, was struggling with feelings that had nothing to do with familial duty and everything to do with the woman she had become. "How long?" she asked. "Sarah, how long have you felt this way?" His shoulders sagged in defeat. 2 years. Maybe longer. I don't know when it started, only when I finally admitted it to myself. Is that why you won't let me leave? Why you won't let me meet other men?" "Partly." He finally turned to face her, and she saw anguish written in every line of his face. "But also because I know what men are like. I know what they'll want from you, what they'll do to you. At least with me, you're safe." "Safe?" Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You think this is safe? You think keeping me here while you feel things you shouldn't, you think that's protecting me?" "I would never touch you," he said fiercely. "I would never do anything to hurt you. You have to believe that, but you've already hurt me." The words came out soft but deadly. "You've stolen my choices, my freedom, my chance at a normal life. You've made me a prisoner in my own home. I gave you everything I had to give, everything except the right to choose my own path." They stared at each other across the firelit room, the weight of spoken truths hanging between them like a chasm neither knew how to cross. "What do you want from me?" Silas asked finally. The question was so loaded with desperation and longing that Sarah felt her anger falter. Looking at him now, this man who had been her protector and her jailer, her salvation and her torment, she realized that they were both prisoners of circumstances neither had chosen. "I want my freedom," she said. "I want the chance to see the world beyond these mountains, to meet other people, to discover who I might become if I'm allowed to make my own choices. And if I can't give you that, then you'll lose me anyway. Because I won't live like this forever, Silas. I won't spend my whole life being your carefully guarded secret." That night, Sarah lay in her loft, listening to Silas's restless movements below. The conversation had changed everything between them, stripping away the comfortable illusions that had allowed them to coexist. Now the truth lay naked between them, his inappropriate feelings, her growing rebellion, the impossible situation they had created together. There could be no going back to the way things were, no pretending that the dangerous undercurrents didn't exist. Sarah touched the mirror fragment she now kept beside her bed, looking at her reflection in the darkness. The woman in the glass looked back with eyes full of new knowledge and terrible possibility. She was beautiful. She was desired. She was trapped. But perhaps, she thought, as sleep finally claimed her, she was also more powerful than she had ever imagined. The question was whether she would have the courage to use that power to claim the freedom she desperately needed, or whether she would allow herself to remain forever suspended between protection and imprisonment, between the safety of captivity and the terrifying promise of choice. The photograph was tucked inside Silas's Bible, pressed between the pages of Ecclesiastes like a prayer made tangible. Sarah found it while searching for something to read during the long winter afternoons, when the silence between them had become too heavy to bear. The image was faded with age, its edges brown and cracked, but the faces that smiled back at her were unmistakably their parents. Her father stood tall and proud beside a young woman in a white dress, their mother, radiating joy and hope in ways Sarah had never seen in her own memories. What struck her most was the obvious love between them. Her father's hand rested gently on her mother's waist, while she leaned into him with complete trust. Their faces glowed with happiness, with the certainty that they had found in each other something precious and worth celebrating. This was what marriage was supposed to look like. Not the brutal ownership Mary Hartwell had described, not the tense possession Sarah felt growing in Silas's treatment of her, but this: partnership, joy, mutual choosing. "Where did you find that?" Sarah startled, turning to find Silas standing in the doorway. His face was carefully blank, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "In your Bible," she replied, holding up the photograph. "Why didn't you ever show this to me? I forgot it was there." "Liar." The word came out matter-of-factly, without heat. "You don't forget anything important. You keep this hidden for the same reason you keep everything else hidden, because you don't want me to see what I'm missing." Silas moved into the room, his eyes fixed on the photograph in her hands. "What do you think you're missing?" "This," Sarah gestured to the image. "Love, real love. The kind where two people choose each other freely and build something beautiful together. Our parents were lucky. Most marriages aren't like that, maybe not. But some are. And don't I deserve the chance to find out which kind mine might be?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photograph with an expression that mixed longing and pain in equal measure. "You want to leave me," he said finally. "I want to live." "Silas, there's a difference. Is there?" He met her eyes and she saw something desperate there. "Because if you leave, if you go out into that world and find some man to marry, what happens to me? What happens to us?" The question caught Sarah off guard. In all her planning and dreaming, she had never considered what her departure would mean for Silas. He would be alone in this mountain cabin, with only his memories and his inappropriate feelings for company. "You could come with me," she offered. "We could go to one of the settlements together. You could find work, maybe even find a wife of your own." "A wife?" Silas laughed bitterly. "What woman would want a man like me? A man who's spent years living alone in the mountains with his—" He stopped himself, but they both knew how the sentence would have ended. "A man who's spent years taking care of his sister," Sarah finished firmly. "A man who's strong and capable and loyal. There are women who would value those qualities. Would they? Even knowing what I feel for you, even knowing how sick and twisted I am inside." "You're not sick or twisted." The words surprised Sarah as she spoke them, but she realized they were true. "You're lonely and confused and dealing with feelings you don't understand. But that doesn't make you a monster, doesn't it?" Silas moved closer and Sarah saw raw pain in his features. "What kind of man wants his own sister? What kind of man keeps a woman prisoner because he can't bear the thought of another man touching her?" "The kind of man who's been alone too long," Sarah said gently. "The kind of man who's forgotten that love isn't about possession." "Then teach me." The words came out raw and desperate. "Tell me what love is supposed to look like, because I don't know anymore. All I know is that the thought of you with someone else makes me feel like I'm dying inside." Sarah looked down at the photograph in her hands, at her parents' radiant faces. Love is what they had. It's choosing someone and being chosen in return. It's building a life together based on respect and partnership, not control and fear. And you think you can find that with some stranger? I think I deserve the chance to try. Silas was quiet for a long time, studying her face as if trying to memorize every detail. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. If I asked you to stay, not as my prisoner but as my wife, what would you say? The question hung between them like a loaded gun. Sarah felt her heart skip, not with desire, but with the recognition of how far they had both fallen into this twisted dynamic. I would say that you can't build a marriage on years of imprisonment, she replied carefully. I would say that I need to know who I am before I can know who I want to be with. Even if who you are includes caring for me. Even if part of you... He stopped, unable to finish the thought. Even if part of me what? Even if part of you feels something for me too? The admission hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Sarah felt her cheeks burn as she recognized the grain of truth in his words. Living so closely with Silas for so many years, seeing his strength and dedication, feeling his protection and care, it had created a bond between them that went beyond simple familial affection. But was it love? Or was it the confused attachment of a prisoner to her captor? The desperate gratitude of someone who had been isolated so long she couldn't tell the difference between genuine feeling and manufactured dependence. I don't know what I feel, she said honestly. How could I? You've made sure I have no other experience to compare it to. Maybe that was the point. Maybe it was. But that doesn't make it right. Silas turned away, moving to stare out the window at the snow-covered peaks that surrounded their valley. Our father brought me up here when I was 16, he said suddenly. Told me it was time I learned to be a man. We spent 3 months alone in these mountains, hunting and trapping, learning to survive. Sarah waited, sensing that this story held important truths. He told me that a man's job was to protect what was his, that the world was full of people who would take everything you cared about if you weren't strong enough to stop them. Silas's voice grew distant with memory. When our parents died and I was suddenly responsible for you, that's all I knew how to do, protect, control, keep safe. But somewhere along the way, protection became something else. Yes, the admission came out like a sigh. Somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you as someone to protect and started seeing you as someone I couldn't live without. Those aren't the same thing. No, they're not. But I didn't know the difference until it was too late. Sarah moved to stand beside him at the window, looking out at the wilderness that had been both their sanctuary and their prison. It's not too late, she said softly. It's never too late to change course. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that if you really love me, if what you feel is genuine care and not just possession, then you'll give me what I need. Which is freedom to choose. Time to discover who I am beyond these mountains. The chance to meet other people and experience the world before I decide what kind of life I want to build. Silas was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think he hadn't heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. And if you discover that what you want doesn't include me, then at least you'll know that any choice I make is real, not the result of manipulation or isolation. And if you discover that it does include me, if you come back, Sarah met his eyes, seeing hope and terror warring in their depths. Then we can talk about building something together, something based on choice instead of captivity. How long? He asked. How long would you need? I don't know. A year, maybe 2. Long enough to see some of the world, to meet other people, to understand what other kinds of life are possible. 2 years. Silas repeated the words like a death sentence. 2 years of not knowing if you're safe, if you're happy, if you're coming back. 2 years of trusting me to make my own decisions. 2 years of proving that what you feel for me is love, not possession. They stood in silence, watching the wind blow snow across the mountain peaks. Sarah could feel Silas wrestling with himself, torn between his need to keep her close and his growing understanding that holding her prisoner was destroying any chance they might have had at genuine happiness. There are conditions, he said finally. What kind of conditions? You take money, enough to keep you safe and fed wherever you go. You write to me regularly, so I know you're alive. And you promise, you swear to me that if you're ever in real danger, you'll come home. Sarah considered his terms. They were reasonable, even protective, in a way that felt caring rather than controlling. And in return, I'll let you go. I'll help you plan a route to whatever town or city you want to see. I'll give you letters of introduction to people I trust along the way. His voice broke slightly. And I'll wait for you to decide if this place, if I, am worth coming back to. The offer was more than Sarah had dared to hope for. It represented a fundamental shift in Silas's thinking, a recognition that love required freedom to be genuine. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. "Don't thank me yet," Silas replied grimly. "Ask me again in 2 years, when you're deciding whether to come home to a man who spent every day wondering if he made the biggest mistake of his life." That night, Sarah held her parents' wedding photograph and tried to imagine what her own future might look like. For the first time in her life, she had the luxury of genuine choice, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The woman in the photograph smiled back at her with joy and hope, and Sarah found herself wondering if she would ever wear that same expression, if she would ever stand beside someone who chose her as freely as she chose him. Time would tell. For now, she had something she had never possessed before, the promise of freedom and the chance to discover who she truly was beyond the confines of Silas McGraw's protective love. The quilt grew slowly through the winter months, taking shape beneath Sarah's careful hands in the quiet hours when Silas was away, checking traps or hunting. She had started it as a way to occupy her mind during the long conversations about her future. But it had become something more, a meditation on the life she dreamed of building. Each square told a story in fabric and thread. Blue calico for the skies she wanted to travel under, green cotton for meadows she had never seen, yellow silk salvaged from her mother's old dress for the warmth of a hearth in a home of her own choosing. And everywhere, subtle patterns of birds in flight, swallows and hawks and wild geese following their own migration paths to destinations unknown. "You're getting good at that," Silas observed one evening. Watching her work by lamplight, Sarah paused in her stitching to look up at him. Their conversations had grown easier since the day he agreed to let her go, though an undercurrent of sadness ran through every interaction like a minor key in a familiar song. "Mother taught me the basics before she died," Sarah replied. "The rest I've learned by trial and error." She would be proud. Silas moved closer to examine her work, careful not to let his fingers brush hers as he traced the intricate pattern. "This is fine enough for any parlor in any city." "Do you think so?" Sarah held up a corner of the quilt, studying the even stitches and careful color combinations. "I sometimes wonder if I have any skills worth anything beyond these mountains." "You have plenty of skills. Cooking, sewing, managing a household. Any man would be lucky to have a wife with your abilities." The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning. They both knew he was talking about the men she might meet during her time away, the potential husbands who might win her heart. "Skills aren't everything," Sarah said carefully. "A marriage needs more than domestic capability." "Like what?" "Like conversation, shared interests, affection that grows from understanding rather than proximity." Silas was quiet for a moment, absorbing the implied criticism of their own relationship. "You think what we have is just proximity?" "I think what we have is complicated by years of an unnatural situation. I don't know what's real feeling and what's just—" She searched for the right words. "What's just the result of having no other options, and you need to find out." "Yes." 3 days later, a traveling preacher arrived at their door. Reverend Thomas Mitchell was a thin, graying man in his 50s who made regular circuits through the mountain communities, bringing news and spiritual comfort to isolated families. Sarah welcomed him eagerly, hungry for conversation with someone outside their closed circle of two. Over dinner, she listened with fascination as he described his travels, the communities he served, the changes he had witnessed in the growing territories. "You have a fine home here," Reverend Mitchell told Silas, "and a sister who's clearly been well cared for." "I've done my best," Silas replied, though his tone was strangely formal. "It's not easy, raising a young woman in such isolation. Have you given thought to her future, to marriage prospects?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the fire. Sarah held her breath, waiting to see how Silas would respond. "Sarah's future is her own to decide," he said finally, the words clearly costing him effort. Reverend Mitchell nodded approvingly. "A wise approach. Too many men make the mistake of trying to control their womenfolk, forgetting that marriage should be a choice made freely by both parties." "Have you seen many unhappy marriages?" Sarah asked, thinking of Mary Hartwell. "More than I care to count," the preacher replied sadly. "Unions forced by convenience or necessity, where love had no chance to grow. But I've also seen marriages that seemed unlikely from the outside, but were built on genuine affection and mutual respect. What makes the difference?" "Choice," Reverend Mitchell said without hesitation. "When two people choose each other freely, knowing they could walk away, but deciding to stay, that's when love has room to flourish." Sarah felt Silas's eyes on her, but she didn't turn to meet his gaze. Instead, she focused on the preacher's words, storing them away like seeds for future consideration. "But surely some unconventional unions can still be blessed?" she asked carefully. "If two people genuinely care for each other, even if their circumstances are unusual?" "God looks at the heart, not the circumstances," Reverend Mitchell replied. "I've seen love sanctify the most unlikely matches. The important thing is that both parties enter into the union willingly, with full understanding of what they're choosing." That evening, after the preacher had retired to the small guest alcove Silas had prepared, Sarah found herself alone with thoughts that tumbled like stones down a mountainside. The Reverend's words about choice echoed everything. She had been thinking about her situation with Silas, but they also opened new possibilities she hadn't fully considered. What if, after her time away, she chose to return not out of dependency or lack of options, but out of genuine affection? What if Silas's love, tested by separation and proven through his willingness to let her go, revealed itself to be something worth accepting? "You asked good questions tonight," Silas said, emerging from the shadows where he had been banking the fire. "I've been thinking about what he said, about choice and love and unusual circumstances, and I realize that part of what I need to discover is whether what I feel for you is real or just the result of having no other experiences to compare it to." Silas nodded slowly. "That's fair, but I also need you to understand something." Sarah turned to face him fully. "The fact that I'm questioning what we have doesn't mean I'm rejecting it entirely. It just means I need to be sure." "Sure of what?" "Sure that if I choose you, it's because I want to be with you, not because I don't know how to be without you." The distinction seemed to strike Silas like a physical blow. He sank into the chair beside the fire, suddenly looking older than his 28 years. "I never thought of it that way," he admitted. "I always assumed that keeping you close was enough, that providing for you and protecting you would be enough, for a child maybe, but not for a woman." "No," he agreed quietly. "Not for a woman." They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the wind whistle through the mountain passes. When Silas finally spoke again, his voice carried a note of resignation mixed with something that might have been relief. "I've been thinking about what you said, about time away, about seeing the world." He paused, seeming to gather courage for his next words. "I think you should go to California." "California?" Sarah couldn't hide her surprise. "It's far enough away that you'll have to rely on yourself, not on the possibility of running home when things get difficult. And there are opportunities there for a woman with your skills, cities where you could work, communities where you could build a life if you choose not to come back." The generosity of the gesture took Sarah's breath away. California was weeks of travel from their mountain home, a journey that would take her farther from Silas than she had ever imagined going. "That's very far," she said softly. "Yes, it is. But if you're going to test what we have, it needs to be a real test. You need to see what else is possible before you can decide if what we might build together is worth choosing." Sarah looked at this man who had controlled her life for so long, now offering her the ultimate freedom, distance enough to forget him entirely if she chose. "What if I like California so much I decide to stay?" "Then I'll know I was right to let you go," Silas replied, though the words clearly cost him. "And I'll know that what I felt wasn't love but selfishness. And what if I hate it? What if I run home after 6 months, miserable and convinced that this cabin is the only place I belong? Then I'll wonder if you're coming back because you truly choose this life or because you're afraid of any other kind." They were both quiet, absorbing the weight of the choice before them. Sarah felt the quilt on her lap, her fingers tracing the patterns of birds in flight. Soon she might be like those birds, following her own migration path toward an unknown destination. "When would I leave?" she asked. "Spring, when the pass is open and travel becomes safer. That gives us time to plan properly, to make sure you have everything you need. And in the meantime, we learn how to say goodbye." The words hung between them like a bridge they would soon have to cross. Sarah folded the quilt carefully, thinking about all the hopes and dreams she had stitched into its fabric. Soon she would find out if those dreams could become reality, or if they would remain forever pressed between layers of cloth like the flowers in her hidden journal, beautiful but ultimately preserved rather than lived. The storm came without warning, a late winter tempest that turned the world outside their cabin into a howling wilderness of wind and snow. Sarah woke to the sound of something heavy crashing against the roof, a tree branch torn loose by the gale, she thought, until she heard the steady drip of water hitting the floor. By morning, it was clear that part of the roof had been damaged. Melting snow was seeping through broken shingles, threatening to soak their winter supplies and ruin the careful preservation work they had done in the fall. "We'll have to move everything," Silas said, surveying the damage. "Get it all to the dry side of the cabin until I can fix this properly." They spent the morning relocating boxes and barrels, uncovering areas of the cabin that hadn't been disturbed in years. It was while moving a heavy trunk from the corner behind Silas's sleeping area that Sarah discovered the loose floorboard. At first, she thought it was just another victim of the cabin's settling over time. But when she knelt to examine it more closely, she realized the board had been deliberately loosened, pried up recently and often, judging by the wear marks around its edges. "Silas," she called. But he was outside assessing the roof damage and didn't hear her over the wind. Curiosity overcoming caution, Sarah lifted the board carefully. Beneath it was a small cavity lined with oiled cloth, and within that protective wrapping lay a collection of papers that made her heart stop. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, legal documents bearing official seals and signatures. With trembling hands, Sarah lifted out the first certificate, her own birth record, yellowed with age but perfectly legible. The names listed as her parents were not James and Eleanor McGraw, but Thomas and Mary Brennan of Denver, Colorado. The date showed she'd been born 3 months earlier than she had always believed, which would make her 23, not 22. But more shocking than the discrepancy in dates was the complete absence of any McGraw name on the document. She reached for the next paper, another birth certificate, this one bearing Silas's name and the correct McGraw parentage. Then a third document that made her hands shake so violently she nearly dropped it, an adoption certificate, dated when Sarah would have been 6 months old, legally transferring custody of Sarah Elizabeth Brennan to James and Eleanor McGraw of the Montana Territory. The reason for adoption was listed simply as death of birth parents in mining accident. Sarah sank back on her heels, the papers scattered around her like leaves from a tree she had never known existed. Every assumption about her identity, every foundation of her relationship with Silas had just crumbled into dust. She was not Sarah McGraw. She was Sarah Brennan, an orphan who had been taken in by people who were no blood relation to her at all. Which meant, "What are you doing?" Sarah looked up to find Silas standing in the doorway, snow still clinging to his coat. His eyes went immediately to the papers in her hands, and his face went white as winter. "What are these?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah, what are these?" she repeated louder now, holding up the adoption certificate. "What is this, Silas?" He moved into the cabin slowly, like a man approaching a wounded animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. "They're documents I should have shown you years ago," he said finally. "I'm not your sister." The words came out flat and emotionless, as if saying them without feeling might somehow make them less earth-shattering. "No, you're not. You've known this all along." "Yes. How long have you known?" Silas closed the door against the wind and moved to sit heavily in the chair by the fire. Since the day James and Eleanor died. They told me the truth on their deathbeds, made me promise to take care of you. You've let me believe we were blood relations for 12 years. Sarah's voice was gaining strength now, fueled by a growing sense of betrayal. You've let me feel guilty about the way I sometimes looked at you, the confused feelings I had. You let me think I was sick and twisted for feeling attracted to my own brother. I thought it was better that way. Better. Sarah stood abruptly, the papers clutching in her fists. Better to let me hate myself? Better to let me think I was some kind of monster? Better than having you realize you were free to leave whenever you wanted, Silas said quietly. The admission hit Sarah like a slap. All the pieces of the puzzle suddenly fell into their proper places. His desperate need to control her movements, his refusal to let her meet other people, his increasing possessiveness as she matured into womanhood. You kept this secret to make me your prisoner, she said, her voice deadly calm. I kept this secret to keep you with me. Same thing, is it? Silas looked up at her with eyes full of pain and desperation. Because if you had known the truth, if you had realized you weren't really my sister, would you have stayed? Would you have let me take care of you, protect you, love you? That should have been my choice to make, and now it is. He gestured to the papers in her hands. Now you know everything. Now you can decide what you want to do with the truth. Sarah stared at him, this man who had shaped her entire life through careful manipulation and deliberate deception. The anger she felt was so pure and clean, it almost took her breath away. You made me complicit in my own imprisonment, she said. You made me police myself because I thought wanting you was wrong. You used my own conscience against me. I used whatever I had to use to keep you safe and close. No, you used whatever you had to use to keep me under control. There's a difference. Silas stood, moving toward her, with his hands extended as if in supplication. Sarah, please, don't. She backed away from him. Don't touch me. Don't try to make this about protection or love or anything noble. You lied to me. For 12 years, you lied to me about the most fundamental facts of my own existence. I was 18 years old when they died, Silas said desperately. I was barely more than a boy myself, suddenly responsible for a 10-year-old girl in the middle of the wilderness. I did what I thought was best. You did what was easiest for you. Maybe, but it kept you alive, didn't it? It kept you fed and sheltered and safe from the kind of men who would have used you and thrown you away. Men like you mean? The words seemed to strike him like a physical blow. He stopped moving toward her, his face crumpling with something that might have been self-recognition. Yes, he said finally. Men like me. Sarah looked at this stranger who wore Silas's face, this man who had controlled her life through lies and manipulation. Everything she thought she knew about herself, about her family, about her place in the world, had been built on a foundation of deception. How many other lies have you told me? She asked. None. Everything else, our parents' love for you, their death, the way we've lived since then, all of that was true, but they weren't our parents. They were your parents who took pity on an orphaned child. They loved you like their own daughter. That part was never a lie. But I'm not their daughter. I'm nobody's daughter. She struggled for words to describe what she was. I'm just someone you've kept like a pet for 12 years. You're the most important person in my life, Silas said quietly. The only person I've ever loved? That's not a lie. How can I believe anything you say now? How can I trust any feeling you claim to have when everything between us has been built on deception? The question hung between them like a chasm neither knew how to cross. Sarah clutched the adoption papers to her chest, feeling as if her entire identity had been ripped away and replaced with something foreign and frightening. What was my real mother's name? She asked suddenly. Mary Brennan. And my father? Thomas Brennan. They died in a mine collapse in Colorado when you were 6 months old. You have no other living relatives that James could locate, so I'm completely alone in the world. No. Silas's voice was fierce with conviction. You have me. I have the man who's been lying to me my entire remembered life. I'm still the same person who raised you, who protected you, who made me believe I was someone I'm not. Sarah shook her head, backing toward the ladder that led to her loft. I need time to think. I can't be around you right now. Sarah, just don't. Not right now. She climbed to her loft and sat on her narrow bed, surrounded by the remnants of a life that suddenly felt like an elaborate fiction. The journal hidden beneath her floorboard, the pressed flowers, the dreams of freedom. All of it took on new meaning now that she knew the truth about her identity. She wasn't Sarah McGraw, protected sister of a mountain man. She was Sarah Brennan, an orphan who had been raised by strangers and kept isolated through deliberate deception. The guilty feelings she had carried about her attraction to Silas, the self-loathing that had accompanied her growing awareness of his inappropriate attention, all of it had been unnecessary. They were not related by blood. There was no biological taboo to overcome, but in some ways that made Silas's behavior even worse. He had known from the beginning that no natural barrier existed between them, yet he had used her ignorance to maintain control. He had let her suffer with guilt and confusion rather than risk losing his hold over her. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound could have. It wasn't just the lies themselves, but the calculated nature of the deception. For 12 years, Silas had watched her struggle with feelings she thought were wrong, had seen her police her own behavior out of misguided shame, and he had never said a word. Now she understood why he had been so desperate to keep her isolated, so afraid of her meeting other people. It wasn't just jealousy or possessiveness. It was the fear that someone might tell her the truth about her origins, might reveal the careful fiction he had constructed around her identity. As the storm raged outside and the damaged roof continued to drip, Sarah began to plan her escape in earnest. She no longer needed Silas's permission to leave or his help in getting away. She was not his sister, not his ward, not his responsibility. She was a grown woman who had been held captive by lies, and now that the truth was finally revealed, she could see clearly for the first time in her life. The only question now was whether she would have the courage to act on that clarity, or whether 12 years of conditioned dependence would prove stronger than her newfound determination to be free. For 3 days after the revelation, Sarah and Silas moved around each other like wary animals, sharing the same den. The damaged roof forced them to remain in close quarters, but they spoke only when necessary. Brief exchanges about meals, repairs, the basic mechanics of survival. Sarah used the time to think, to process the enormity of what she had learned. In quiet moments, she found herself studying Silas from across the cabin, trying to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the calculating deceiver who had shaped her entire life through lies. He looked older, she realized. The weight of his secret seemed to have aged him overnight, adding lines around his eyes and a stoop to his shoulders that hadn't been there before. He worked on the roof repairs with grim determination, as if physical labor might somehow repair the damage his deception had done to their relationship. On the 4th day, Sarah made her decision. "I'm leaving," she announced over breakfast. Silas's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "When?" "As soon as the weather clears enough for travel." "Where will you go?" "Denver first. I want to see where I was born, learn what I can about my real parents. After that," she shrugged, I'll figure it out as I go. You don't have to leave immediately, Silas said carefully. We could still wait for spring, plan properly. No! Sarah's voice was firm. I've been planning my life around your lies for too long. From now on, I make my own decisions. Sarah, please, let me explain. Explain what? How you decided that keeping me ignorant was better than letting me choose my own path. How you watched me hate myself for feelings that weren't even wrong. She shook her head. There's nothing to explain. You did what served your purposes, and now I'm doing what serves mine. Silas set down his fork, his appetite clearly gone. You're right to be angry. You're right to leave. But you're not prepared for what's out there. You don't know how cruel the world can be to a woman alone. Then I'll learn. You could be hurt, killed, worse. That's my risk to take. The simplicity of her response seemed to deflate him. For years, his arguments about danger and protection had been enough to keep her compliant. Now, armed with the truth about her identity, she was immune to his familiar tactics. What can I do to make this right? He asked desperately. Nothing. You can't undo 12 years of deception with an apology. Then what? Do I just let you walk away and never see you again? Sarah considered the question seriously. I don't know. Maybe. Right now I can't imagine ever trusting you enough to have any kind of relationship. The words hit him like physical blows. Silas pushed back from the table and moved to stare out the window at the clearing sky. I love you, he said quietly. I know you don't believe that anymore, but it's true. Everything I did was because I couldn't bear the thought of losing you. Love doesn't justify what you did, doesn't it? He turned to face her, and she saw anguish written in every line of his features. If you love someone more than your own life, wouldn't you do whatever it took to keep them safe and close? Not if it meant destroying who they were in the process. I didn't destroy you. I protected you. You stole my choices. You made me a prisoner in my own life. How is that protection? Silas was quiet for a long moment, struggling with concepts that clearly challenged everything he believed about love and care. What if I could prove to you that my feelings are real? He asked finally. What if I could show you that this isn't just possession or control? How? By letting you go, completely, no conditions, no expectations, no attempts to track or follow you. Just freedom, pure and simple. Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or hidden agenda. And in return? Nothing. I ask for nothing in return except, he paused, seeming to gather courage, except the possibility that someday, when you've had time to heal from what I did, you might consider giving me a chance to earn your forgiveness. That could take years. I'll wait. I might never forgive you. I'll still wait. I might fall in love with someone else. Marry someone else? Build a life that has no room for you in it. This possibility seemed to cause him physical pain, but he nodded. Then I'll be happy that you found what you needed, even if it wasn't with me. Sarah searched his face for any sign that he was lying, that this was just another manipulation designed to make her lower her guard. But all she saw was genuine sorrow and a desperate hope that she might someday understand his motivations, if not forgive them. Why now? She asked. Why are you suddenly willing to let me go when you fought so hard to keep me here? Because I finally understand the difference between loving someone and owning them. Because I realize that if I truly love you, I have to want what's best for you, even if it destroys me. And you think leaving is what's best for me. I think choosing is what's best for you. Whether you choose to leave or stay, whether you choose to forgive me or hate me forever, the important thing is that it's your choice. That afternoon, Silas began preparing for her departure with the same methodical care he brought to everything else. He counted out money from his hidden reserves, more than Sarah had ever seen, in one place. He cleaned and oiled his father's rifle, wrapping it carefully along with ammunition and cleaning supplies. You'll need protection, he said when she protested the weapon, and you'll need something to trade if money runs short. This rifle is worth more than most people see in a year. Sarah watched him work, noting the careful attention he paid to every detail. He packed traveling clothes he had somehow acquired without her knowledge, sturdy boots in her size, a heavy coat lined with fur, undergarments and dresses suitable for town wear. When did you get these?" she asked, fingering the fine fabric of a blue dress that would have cost more than their usual supplies for months. "Last time I went to town. I told the shopkeeper they were for my wife." His voice was carefully neutral. "I hoped that someday you might want them." The admission revealed another layer of his complex feelings. Even while keeping her prisoner, he had been planning for a future where she might be free to live as a lady rather than a mountain hermit. The contradiction of it made her head spin. "There's something else," Silas said, moving to his sleeping area and returning with a small wooden box. "Something that belonged to your real mother." Sarah's breath caught as he opened the box to reveal a delicate gold locket on a thin chain. The metal was tarnished with age, but the engraving was still visible, a rose surrounded by tiny leaves with the initials MB carved beneath. "Mary Brennan," Silas explained. "She was wearing it when James found you. He saved it for when you were old enough to understand." Sarah lifted the locket with trembling fingers, opening it to reveal two tiny photographs, a young woman with Sarah's eyes and a serious-looking man with kind features. "My parents," she whispered. "Your birth parents, yes. James said they were good people, well respected in their community. They would have been proud of the woman you've become." The generosity of the gesture caught Sarah off guard. After days of anger and recrimination, this unexpected gift of her heritage felt like a bridge across the chasm between them. "Why are you giving me this now?" "Because you deserve to know where you came from. Because you deserve to carry something of your real family with you." Silas paused, his voice growing thick with emotion. "And because I want you to know that even though I stole your choices, I never forgot that you had your own history. Your own identity beyond what I tried to make you." Sarah fastened the locket around her neck, feeling the weight of it settle against her heart like a blessing. For the first time since discovering the truth about her origins, she felt connected to something larger than the lies and deceptions that had shaped her life. "Thank you," she said simply. "There's one more thing." Silas returned to his preparations, pulling out a leather portfolio filled with papers. "Letters of introduction to people I trust along the route to Denver. Bank drafts that will allow you to access money in any major town." And he hesitated, then handed her a sealed envelope. "A letter explaining everything for when you're ready to read it. My reasons, my regrets, my hopes for your future. I may never read it, I know. But I needed to write it anyway." That evening, as they shared what might be their last meal together, the cabin felt heavy with unspoken emotions. Sarah found herself studying Silas's face, memorizing details she had taken for granted for so many years. The scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the gentle way he handled even the most mundane objects. Tomorrow, she would leave this place that had been both sanctuary and prison. Tomorrow, she would walk away from the only family she had ever known, regardless of blood relation or the circumstances that had brought them together. "Are you afraid?" Silas asked quietly. "Terrified," Sarah admitted, "but also excited. For the first time in my life, I don't know what comes next. That's a gift, even if it doesn't feel like one right now. Is it? The unknown is where possibilities live, where dreams have room to become real instead of just staying wishes." They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts about the future. Finally, Silas spoke again. "If you ever need anything, money, help, a place to come back to, you'll always have that here. No matter what happens between us, no matter how you feel about me, this will always be your home if you want it. Even if I never forgive you? Even then? Even if I come back married to someone else?" The question clearly pained him, but he nodded. "Even then, though I might build a separate cabin for your husband and myself," he added, with the faintest hint of humor. Despite everything, Sarah found herself almost smiling. "You'd do that?" "I'd do whatever it took to have you in my life, even if it was just as a neighbor and friend. And if I never come back at all, then I'll spend the rest of my life knowing that I love someone enough to let them be free." Even when it broke my heart, that night Sarah lay in her loft for the last time, listening to the familiar sounds of the cabin settling around her. Tomorrow would bring the unknown, danger and possibility in equal measure. But tonight, for the first time since discovering the truth about her identity, she felt something that might have been peace. Whatever else Silas had done, however he had manipulated and controlled her, his willingness to let her go felt like genuine love. Not the possessive obsession she had feared, but something deeper and more generous, the kind of love that wanted the beloved's happiness even at the cost of its own. Whether that love was enough to eventually bridge the gap between them remained to be seen. But it was, Sarah thought as sleep finally claimed her. A beginning. Sarah stood at the edge of the clearing, her traveling pack heavy on her shoulders, the rifle slung across her back like a promise of independence. The morning sun painted the snow-covered peaks gold and rose, transforming the familiar landscape into something magical and strange, a fitting backdrop for the most important decision of her life. Silas waited beside the cabin, holding the reins of the horse he had prepared for her journey. The animal was strong and reliable, one of their best, loaded with supplies for the long ride to Denver. His sacrifice of such valuable resources spoke louder than any words about his commitment to her freedom. The first town is Bear Creek, about 2 days' ride southeast, he said, handing her a carefully drawn map. Jakob Mueller runs the general store there. He's a good man who'll help you get your bearings. Sarah took the map, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through her, a reminder of the complicated emotions that still existed beneath her anger and hurt. After that, she asked, after that, you follow your own judgment. The letters of introduction will help, but trust your instincts about people. You've got good instincts, even if you've never had a chance to use them. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, both aware that this was probably goodbye forever. Sarah found herself studying his face one last time, noting the way the morning light caught the gray in his hair, the deep lines around his eyes that spoke of years of worry and responsibility. I want to hate you, she said suddenly. You should hate me, but I don't. Not completely. And that makes this harder, Silas nodded, understanding flooding his features. Love and hate aren't opposites. They're neighbors who share a fence. Is that what this is? Love? On my part, yes. Twisted and selfish and wrong in so many ways, but love nonetheless. He paused, seeming to gather courage for his next words. What is it on your part? Sarah considered the question seriously. After years of confusion and guilt, she owed them both honesty. I don't know, she admitted. You raised me, protected me, cared for me when no one else would. You're the only family I've ever known. But you also lied to me, controlled me, kept me from becoming who I might have been. How do I separate the love from the damage? Maybe you don't have to. Maybe they can coexist until you figure out which one is stronger. The wisdom in his words surprised her. This was not the controlling, desperate man who had kept her isolated for so many years. This was someone deeper, more thoughtful. Perhaps the person he might have been if circumstances had been different. I have something for you, Silas said, reaching into his coat pocket. Something I should have given you years ago. He pulled out a simple gold band, not ornate or expensive, but clearly well made and well cared for. Sarah recognized it immediately as his mother's wedding ring, the one Silas McGraw had worn until the day she died. Silas, I can't, not as a claim, he said quickly, not as a promise or an expectation, but as a symbol of choice. If you ever decide, if you ever choose to come back and build something real with me, then this will be waiting. He held the ring out to her, and Sarah saw his hand tremble slightly with the magnitude of the gesture. This was not the desperate possessiveness she had come to expect from him. This was an offering made without conditions, a gift that asked for nothing in return. What if I never come back? She asked. Then the ring will stay in its box and I'll know that I loved someone enough to let them choose their own happiness. And what if I come back in love with someone else? Then I'll give you my blessing and dance at your wedding, even if it kills me. The sincerity in his voice took her breath away. Sarah stared at the ring, understanding that accepting it would not bind her to any particular future, but would acknowledge the possibility that their story might not be over. "I'm not promising anything," she said finally, taking the ring and slipping it into her pocket. "I'm not asking for promises. I'm asking for possibility. Even possibility might be more than I can give. Then give me what you can, when you can. I'll take whatever scraps of hope you're willing to share." Sarah swung up into the saddle, settling herself with the practiced ease of someone who had been riding since childhood. From horseback, she looked down at Silas and saw him as if for the first time, not as the overbearing guardian who had controlled her life, but as a man who had loved unwisely and was now paying the price for his mistakes. "If I do come back," she said carefully, "things would have to be different, equal. I'd have to be a partner, not a possession. I understand. I'd have to know that I could leave again if I chose to, that this cabin would be home, not prison. You'd always be free to go. And I'd have to know that any children we might have would be raised with the freedom I was denied. No lies, no manipulation, no cages disguised as protection. They would be raised to make their own choices, even if those choices led them away from us." Sarah nodded, satisfied with his answers, even as she wondered if he truly understood what he was promising. Words were easy. Living by them would be the real test. "Goodbye, Silas. Goodbye, Sarah. Ride safe. And remember, you're stronger than you know." She nudged the horse forward, not looking back, as she left the clearing and entered the tree line. But she could feel Silas watching her until the forest swallowed her up, and she carried the weight of his gaze like a blessing and a burden in equal measure. The trail down the mountain was treacherous but familiar. Sarah had walked portions of it during her carefully supervised expeditions to gather herbs and hunt small game. Now riding it alone toward an uncertain future, every turn felt like a step into a larger world. As the altitude dropped and the trees changed from pine to aspen to oak, Sarah felt something she had never experienced before, the intoxicating sensation of moving through space according to her own will. No one was waiting for her return. No one was counting the hours of her absence or preparing to scold her for taking too long. She was free to ride fast or slow, to stop and rest or push through until darkness fell. The freedom was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. By evening, she had covered more ground than she had expected, reaching a ridge that offered a panoramic view of the valley spread out below. For the first time in her life, Sarah could see beyond the mountains that had bounded her world. In the distance, smoke rose from chimneys she could not see, marking the presence of people living lives she could barely imagine. That night, she made camp beside a stream, building a small fire and preparing a simple meal from the supplies Silas had packed. As she ate, she pulled out the locket he had given her and studied the faces of her birth parents by firelight. They looked young and hopeful, these people who had given her life, but not the chance to know them. Sarah wondered what they would think of the woman she had become, what advice they might have given her about the choice she was making, but dwelling on the past felt less important than embracing the future. Tomorrow, she would reach Bear Creek and begin the real test of her independence. Tomorrow, she would start discovering who Sarah Brennan could become when she was free to choose her own path. As she settled into her bedroll, Sarah's hand found the ring in her pocket, Silas's mother's ring, offered without conditions, but weighted with possibility. She thought about the man she had left behind, alone in his mountain cabin, with only his regrets for company. Time would tell whether his love was genuine enough to sustain the test of separation, whether her own feelings could evolve beyond the confusion of captivity and control. Time would tell whether they could build something real together, or whether this goodbye was truly final. But tonight, under a canopy of stars she had never seen from this vantage point, Sarah chose to believe in possibility rather than certainty. The ring would stay in her pocket, not as a promise, but as a reminder that some stories were too complex to end with simple answers. 2 years later, Sarah stood on the platform of the Denver train station, watching the mountain peaks rise in the distance like familiar friends welcoming her home. The woman who stepped down from the passenger car bore little resemblance to the frightened girl who had fled the mountain cabin with nothing but anger and hurt to sustain her. Her traveling dress was well made but practical, her hair arranged in the fashionable style she had learned in San Francisco, her bearing confident in ways that spoke of hard-won independence. In her reticule, she carried letters from the school where she had taught for the past year, references from the boarding house where she had lived, and a small savings account that represented her own efforts and abilities. She also carried, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, a wedding dress she had made with her own hands, fashioned from the quilt she had started in those last months at the cabin, its patterns of birds in flight now transformed into something new and beautiful. The train journey from California had given her days to think about the decision she was making, to examine her motivations and be certain of her choice. She was not returning to Silas out of desperation or lack of options. She was not the confused, dependent girl he had once controlled. She was a woman who had seen the world, tested her strength, and discovered that freedom meant not just the ability to leave, but the power to choose where to stay. Miss Brennan? Sarah turned to find a young man in a worn but clean suit approaching her on the platform. He was perhaps 25, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of honest work. Yes? I'm David Mitchell, Reverend Mitchell's son. Your Mr. McGraw asked me to meet your train and escort you to Bear Creek. That is, if you're willing to accept the escort. Sarah smiled at the careful way he phrased the offer, clearly instructed to respect her independence. That's very kind. How is your father? Well, thank you. He's been hoping to see you again, says he's been praying for your safe return. As they loaded her trunk into the wagon, David kept up a steady stream of gentle conversation that revealed much about the changes that had occurred during her absence. Silas had become something of a legend in the small mountain communities. They said, the hermit who had let his sister go to find herself, who waited patiently for her return without knowing if she would ever come back. Folks respect him for it, David said, as they began the familiar journey into the mountains. Takes a strong man to love someone enough to let them choose their own path. Has he? Sarah hesitated, then decided directness was best. Has he had visitors? Female visitors? David shook his head. None that anyone's heard tell of. He comes to town maybe once a month for supplies, always asks if there's been any word from you, then heads back to his cabin. Polite enough, but keeps to himself mostly. The information both relieved and concerned Sarah. She was glad he hadn't found comfort with someone else, but worried about the isolation she had left him in. What about you? David asked with the careful curiosity of a young man interested in an attractive woman. Did California treat you well? Very well. I taught school in a small town outside San Francisco, lived with a lovely family who treated me like a daughter. I saw the ocean, attended theater performances, made friends with people from all over the world, but you came back. I came back. May I ask why? Sarah considered the question as they wound through increasingly familiar terrain. How could she explain the gradual realization that freedom wasn't just about escaping limitations, but about choosing where to invest your heart? How could she describe the way she had tested her feelings against new experiences, new possibilities, and found that what she felt for Silas was real enough to survive separation and strong enough to build upon? Because I discovered that love freely chosen is different from love imposed, she said finally. And I want to see if what we have, stripped of deception and control, might be worth nurturing. They reached the cabin at sunset, the golden light painting the familiar clearing in warm tones that made Sarah's heart skip with recognition and longing. The place looked smaller than she remembered, but well maintained, the roof properly repaired, new windows installed, a small garden plot prepared for spring planting. Silas emerged from the cabin as they pulled up, and Sarah felt her breath catch at the sight of him. He was thinner than she remembered, with more grey in his hair and deeper lines around his eyes. But he carried himself with a quiet dignity that spoke of acceptance and growth. He helped her down from the wagon without speaking, his hands gentle and brief in their contact. Only when David had unloaded her trunk and departed with promises to return for Sunday services did Silas finally look directly into her eyes. "You came back," he said simply. "I came back. For how long?" The question was asked without pressure or expectation, simply a request for information that would help him understand what to hope for. "That depends," Sarah replied, pulling the ring from her reticule and holding it between them like a bridge across 2 years of separation. "That depends on whether you still think we might be able to build something real together." Silas stared at the ring, his mother's ring, and Sarah saw his hands tremble slightly as he reached for it. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Are you certain this is what you want, not just what you think you should want?" "I'm sure. I spent 2 years testing that certainty against every other possibility I could imagine. I'm not that frightened girl anymore, Silas. I'm a woman who's seen enough of the world to know what she's choosing. And what are you choosing?" "I'm choosing you. I'm choosing us. I'm choosing to see if two people who've hurt each other can learn to love each other properly." Silas slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that shook with emotion. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. "There's something you should know," he said. "I've been seeing Reverend Mitchell regularly, working through, trying to understand what I did wrong, how to do better, and what did you learn? That love isn't about keeping someone safe from the world. It's about helping them become strong enough to face whatever the world brings." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "That partnership means 2 people choosing each other every day, not one person making all the choices for both. And do you think you can live by those principles?" "I think I can learn to. With your help." Sarah smiled, feeling something tight in her chest finally release. "Then maybe we should start with a proper proposal. One that asks instead of assumes." Silas took her hands in his expression suddenly vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. "Sarah Elizabeth Brennan," he said formally, "will you marry me? Will you be my partner and my equal? Will you help me learn how to love you the way you deserve to be loved?" "Yes," she replied without hesitation. Yes to all of it. They were married 3 weeks later by Reverend Mitchell, with half the mountain community in attendance. Sarah wore her quilt dress with pride, its patterns of birds in flight now transformed into symbols of love that had learned to soar. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, their vows spoken with the weight of hard-won wisdom behind them. That night, in the cabin that had once been her prison, but was now freely chosen as her home, Sarah and Silas began the careful work of building a marriage based on truth instead of deception, on choice instead of control. It wouldn't be easy. Years of unhealthy patterns don't disappear overnight. But as they lay together in the darkness, listening to the wind whisper through the mountain passes, both of them felt the deep satisfaction of having found their way to something real and lasting. The cross on the wall still hung slightly crooked, but now it seemed less like a symbol of lost faith and more like a reminder that even broken things could be made beautiful again with patience and care. 5 years after their wedding, Sarah McGraw stood in the doorway of their transformed cabin, watching her husband teach their 3-year-old daughter how to identify animal tracks in the snow. The scene filled her with a contentment so deep it still sometimes surprised her. This life she had chosen and continued to choose every day. The cabin had grown over the years, expanded to include a proper parlor, a larger kitchen, and bedrooms for the children they hoped would fill their home. But more than the physical changes, the spirit of the place had been transformed. Where once locked doors and hidden truths had dominated, now open windows and honest conversations created an atmosphere of warmth and trust. "Mama, look!" Little Eleanor, named for the woman who had loved Sarah as her own, pointed excitedly at the tracks Silas was showing her. "Rabbit." "Very good, Ellie," Sarah called back, one hand resting on her rounded belly where their second child grew. "What do rabbit tracks tell us?" "That dinner might be hopping around nearby," Silas answered with a grin, earning delighted giggles from his daughter. The easy affection between father and child warmed Sarah's heart. True to his promises, Silas was raising Eleanor with the freedom Sarah had been denied, encouraging her curiosity, answering her questions honestly, and teaching her that the world was a place to explore rather than fear. "She's going to be every bit as stubborn as her mother," Silas observed as Eleanor ran ahead to investigate more tracks, her small legs carrying her fearlessly through the snow. "Good," Sarah replied. "Stubborn women change the world. They certainly changed mine." The comment was delivered lightly, but Sarah heard the depth of gratitude beneath it. Their marriage had not been without challenges. 5 years of unlearning old patterns and building new ones had required patience, forgiveness, and more difficult conversations than either had anticipated. But each obstacle overcome had strengthened their bond, proving that love built on choice and mutual respect could weather any storm. A new sound caught Sarah's attention, the jingle of harness and the creak of wagon wheels approaching through the trees. Visitors were still rare in their mountain valley, but no longer unexpected. Word had spread through the territory about the mountain man who had let his sister go and won her back through patience rather than possession. Their story had become something of a legend, inspiring other couples to examine their own relationships and choose partnership over domination. "Expecting someone?" Sarah asked as a wagon emerged from the tree line. "Old Pete said he might stop by this week," Silas replied, scooping up Eleanor and settling her on his shoulders. "Been talking about heading to California himself. Wanted to ask about your experiences there." The visitor proved to be Pete indeed, but he wasn't alone. Beside him on the wagon seat sat a handsome woman of perhaps 40, her graying hair neatly arranged and her clothing speaking of recent prosperity. "Silas." "Sarah," Pete called out, waving enthusiastically. "Hope you don't mind unexpected company. Got someone here who's been mighty eager to meet you." The woman climbed down from the wagon with practiced ease, then turned to face Sarah with eyes that were startlingly familiar, the same deep blue that looked back from Sarah's own mirror each morning. "Sarah Brennan McGraw?" the woman asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes. My name is Catherine Brennan Walsh. I believe I'm your aunt." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She stared at this stranger who bore such a strong resemblance to the woman in her locket, struggling to process the implications of what she was hearing. "My aunt? But I was told. The records said I had no living relatives." "The records were wrong," Catherine said gently. "I was in Chicago when our brother Thomas died, married and using my husband's name. By the time I learned about the mining accident and came looking, you had already been adopted and taken somewhere out west. I've been searching for you for over 20 years. Sarah felt Silas's hand on her shoulder, steadying her as the revelation sank in. She was not completely alone in the world after all. Somewhere family had been looking for her, grieving her loss, hoping for reunion. "How did you find me?" "Your story," Catherine replied with a smile. "It's been told in mining camps and settlements all across the territory. The woman who went to California to find herself and came back to marry the man who learned to love her properly. When someone mentioned the name Sarah Brennan, I knew I had to come see for myself." Over dinner that evening, Catherine shared stories about Sarah's birth parents that filled in gaps she had carried her whole life. Thomas Brennan had been a dreamer who believed in the promise of the California gold rush. Mary had followed him west out of love, but both had possessed practical skills that served them well in their new life. They had been devoted to each other and thrilled about their baby daughter, making plans for her education and future, even as they struggled to establish themselves in the harsh mining territory. "They would be so proud of what you've become," Catherine said, studying Sarah's face in the lamplight, "and of the choice you made to build a life based on love rather than convenience." "It wasn't always easy," Sarah admitted. "Learning to trust again after years of deception, figuring out how to be partners instead of captor and captive." "The best things rarely are easy," Catherine replied, "but they're worth the effort." As the evening wore on, Catherine extended an invitation that would have seemed impossible just years before, a request for Sarah and Silas to visit her ranch in Colorado, To meet the cousins Sarah had never known existed, to become part of a larger family that had never stopped hoping for her return. "We'll come," Sarah said without hesitation, then looked to Silas for confirmation. "Won't we?" "Of course," he replied immediately. Eleanor should know her family, the easy agreement, the assumption that they would make such decisions together, demonstrated how far they had both traveled from their early dynamic of control and submission. After their guests retired for the night, Sarah and Silas sat together by the fire, processing the day's revelations. Eleanor slept peacefully in her small bed, worn out by the excitement of meeting her newfound great-aunt. "Are you happy about this?" Silas asked, studying Sarah's profile in the firelight. "I think so. It's overwhelming, but good overwhelming, to discover that I have family, that there are people who've been looking for me all these years. It feels like a gift. It doesn't change anything between us." The question was asked with the confidence of a man who had learned to trust in his wife's freely given love, but Sarah understood the need for reassurance. Their happiness had been hard-won. It was natural to want confirmation that new developments wouldn't threaten what they had built. "It changes everything and nothing," she replied thoughtfully. "It gives me a larger sense of who I am, where I come from. But it doesn't change who I choose to be or who I choose to love. And who do you choose to love?" "You," Sarah said simply, turning to meet his eyes. "Every day I choose you, not because I have to, not because I'm afraid to be alone, but because what we've built together is worth choosing." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the flames dance in the hearth. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing their valley in pristine white that would melt with spring's arrival. The cycle of seasons continued as it always had, but now Sarah saw it as a symbol of renewal rather than endless repetition. "I've been thinking," Silas said eventually, "about building a proper door for the cabin. What's wrong with the door we have?" "Nothing exactly, but I thought, what if we built one with windows? And maybe we could leave it unlocked most of the time." Sarah smiled, understanding the symbolism behind his suggestion. The door they currently used was solid wood, installed by his father years ago as protection against the dangers of the wilderness. A door with windows would represent trust in each other, in their community, in the future they were building together. "I think that sounds perfect," she said. "A door that lets in light and makes it clear that anyone who wants to leave is free to go. And anyone who wants to stay is welcome to choose that too, especially that." As they prepared for bed, Sarah touched the locket at her throat, her birth mother's locket, now joined by the simple gold band that marked her marriage to Silas. Old family and new, birth identity and chosen identity, all woven together into the complex tapestry of a life lived with intention and love. Tomorrow would bring new conversations with Catherine. New stories about the family Sarah had never known she had. Next year would bring a new baby, new challenges, new opportunities to choose each other and the life they were building together. But tonight, as she settled into bed beside the man who had learned to love her with open hands instead of clenched fists, Sarah felt the deep satisfaction of a woman who had claimed her own destiny and found it good. The crooked cross still hung on the wall, but now it seemed less like a symbol of broken faith and more like a reminder that even the most twisted beginnings could lead to beautiful endings if you had the courage to choose love over fear, freedom over control, and truth over the comfortable lies that seemed easier to bear. Outside, the mountain wind whispered through the peaks that had once seemed like prison walls, but now felt like protective arms, embracing a home built on the solid foundation of choice, respect and love freely given and gratefully received.